My name is Alara Vance, and I'm 33 years old. 5 years ago, my sister, Serena, stole my life's work. She took the blueprints that held my soul, put her name on them, and won the contract that was supposed to define our legacy. But that wasn't enough. She told our parents I'd had a nervous breakdown, that I'd abandoned the project, that I'd abandoned them. And in a single phone call, they cut me off. They erased me. They weren't there when my name was dragged through the mud. They didn't answer when I called from a cheap motel in a city I didn't know. For 5 years, I was no one's daughter, a ghost in the machine I had designed. Then, last month, a hairline fracture was discovered in the primary load-bearing cantilever of the Skybridge Museum. A tiny, insidious crack, a whisper of catastrophic failure in the heart of the building that made my sister a global icon. The engineers were baffled. The city was panicking. They convened an emergency summit, bringing in the best minds in the world to stare at the problem. And when the finest structural engineers in the country finally threw up their hands, one old man who remembered a disgraced young architect from years ago made a phone call. He called the ghost. He called me. Before we get into this, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story speaks to a part of you that knows what it's like to be silenced. Drop a comment and let me know where you are in the world right now. I want to know who is listening. 5 years ago, my sister took my masterpiece and my family. Now, that same masterpiece is breaking, and they need the ghost they created to save it. It's funny how structures work. You can build the most beautiful facade, clad it in Italian marble and polished chrome, make it the talk of the town. You can win awards with it, have your picture taken in front of it for glossy magazines, and convince the world it's the strongest, most brilliant thing ever conceived. But if the load-bearing columns have been compromised, if the original design was tampered with by someone who valued aesthetics over integrity, the whole damn thing will eventually come down. The truth has a physics of its own. I'm sitting in a sterile, white conference room in Chicago, looking at a set of blueprints projected on a screen. Not my blueprints, not anymore. These are the as-builts for the Skybridge Museum, Serena's magnum opus. My magnum opus. Arthur sits beside me, his gnarled engineer's hands clasped on the table. He's 72, with more knowledge about reinforced concrete in his little finger than Serena has in her entire celebrated career. He was the one who called me. "The crack," he'd said, his voice gravelly over the phone. "It's not a material flaw, Alara. It's a design flaw. It's behaving exactly like you predicted it would if they simplified the kinetic armature." A kinetic armature. That was my term. Part of a design philosophy I called dynamic architecture. The idea that a building shouldn't just be a static object, but a living thing, capable of minutely shifting and redistributing stress in response to environmental factors. It was my soul, rendered in steel and glass. And Serena, my charming, brilliant, deal-making sister, had simplified it. She'd cut the heart out of it to make it cheaper, easier, and most importantly, hers. She'd removed the nuance because she never understood it in the first place. And now, 5 years later, the ghost of that decision was showing up as a hairline fracture, a cancer in the bone of the building. The invitation to the emergency summit in New York sits in my inbox, a ticking time bomb. Your presence is requested, unparalleled expertise, confidential. They don't know who E.V., the mysterious Chicago-based restoration architect, really is. They don't know they're asking the person whose name was erased from those very blueprints to come back and fix them. Serena will be there. My parents, Richard and Eleanor Vance, the financial backers who proudly stood by as one daughter accepted global acclaim while the other vanished, will be there. They'll be in the front row, radiating pride for the facade, completely oblivious to the rot in the foundation. For 5 years, I've been rebuilding myself in the quiet, unglamorous world of brick restoration and structural reinforcement. I made a name for myself by fixing the broken things others left behind. The irony is so thick I could choke on it. But I'm not the broken girl who fled New York anymore. I am the expert they need. I am the only one who knows exactly where the stress points are, because I'm the one who designed them. And I'm the one who knows how much pressure a structure can take before it collapses entirely. I learned that lesson the hard way. Now, let me take you back to a sun-drenched office in Soho, to the fall of 2021, the day the Skybridge competition was announced. It was the last time my sister looked at me with something that resembled shared excitement, a brief, shining moment before the shadow of her ambition consumed everything. Our office, Vance & Vance Designs, was on the 5th floor of a pre-war building with huge, rattling windows that overlooked the controlled chaos of Mercer Street. The space was a perfect metaphor for our partnership. Sleek, minimalist furniture and a pristine client-facing area, all Serena, backed by a chaotic, paper-strewn studio in the rear where I did the actual work. That morning, the light was golden, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. I was hunched over a light table, refining the details for a residential loft, lost in the familiar language of lines and angles. Serena swept in, as she always did, a whirlwind of expensive perfume and kinetic energy. She was wearing a tailored blazer that probably cost more than my rent, her phone pressed to her ear. "Absolutely, Mr. DeWitt. The preliminary sketches will be with you by 5. Talk soon." She ended the call and tossed the phone onto her glass desk with a triumphant clatter. "Clear your schedule, little sister," she said, her voice buzzing. She turned the large monitor on her desk towards me. The screen was filled with the official announcement from the New York City Architectural Guild. The Skybridge Museum Design Competition. It wasn't just any project. It was the project. A new museum of technology and design, poised to become the modern jewel of the city's skyline. It was a career maker, a legacy builder. For years, every architect in the city had been whispering about it. It was our moonshot. I felt a jolt, a pure, unadulterated surge of creative adrenaline that I hadn't felt in years. I walked over to her desk, my eyes scanning the project parameters. Cantilever design over the East River, a focus on sustainable innovation, a structure that was as much a part of the exhibit as the art within it. It was a problem so complex, so beautiful, it made my teeth ache. "We can do this, Serena," I whispered, more to myself than to her. She smiled then, a genuine, wide-open smile that reached her eyes. It was the smile from our childhood, from before we understood that our respective talents put us on a collision course. "We can? Alara, look at this. This isn't a building. It's a statement. This is everything we've talked about." And in that moment, we were a team. Not the face and the phantom, but partners. She saw the ambition, the scale, the victory. I saw the challenge, the materials, the impossible elegance of the physics required. We were two halves of a single ambition. She paced the room, already spinning the narrative, the pitch. Vance & Vance isn't just building a museum, we're crafting the future, a bridge between the old New York and the new. Her hands moved as she spoke, sculpting the air. She was the conductor. I was the composer. For that one afternoon, the roles worked. We ordered takeout, spread the competition briefs across my drafting table, and dreamed. She talked about the press, the gala, the people we'd meet. I sketched, my pencil flying across the paper, the first raw ideas for a building that could breathe, that could shift, that could live. I remember looking up at her, her face illuminated by the setting sun through the window, and feeling a deep, reassuring sense of hope. I thought this project would be the thing that finally fused us together, that would make the world and our parents see that Vance and Vance was two people. I was so wrong. I was looking at the blueprint of a partnership. I just didn't realize I was the only one reading it correctly. The foundation of our shared dream was already cracked, and I was too busy designing the future to notice. To understand why Serena did what she did, you have to understand the architecture of our family. Growing up in the Vance house in Greenwich, Connecticut, meant there were two daughters, but only one star. Serena was the sun, and I was a planet caught in her orbit, useful only for the life I might help sustain. She was born performing. She came out of the womb with perfect pitch and an innate understanding of how to charm adults. At dinner parties, 3-year-old Serena would hold court, telling stories that made my parents' friends roar with laughter. I'd be under the table, building houses out of forks and sugar cubes. Our parents, Richard and Eleanor Vance, weren't cruel people. They were just blind. They were products of their generation, valuing appearances, ambition, and the kind of easy, marketable success they could brag about at the country club. Dad was a real estate developer who saw the world in terms of square footage and return on investment. Mom was a former art gallery owner who curated our lives like an exhibition, ensuring everything was aesthetically pleasing and commercially viable. Serena was their masterpiece. She was student council president, debate team captain, the lead in every school play. Her successes were loud, public, and easy to applaud. My successes were quiet. In 8th grade, I won the state-level physics Olympiad with a project on the tensile strength of carbon nanotubes. It was the same weekend Serena had a regional debate tournament. One guess where my parents went. When I came home with the first-place medal, Dad glanced at it from behind his Wall Street Journal and said, "That's nice, Ellie. Keep it up." He never asked what the project was about. He didn't know how. To him, physics was just a collection of invisible forces, much like the daughter who was obsessed with them. It wasn't that they were forgetting me. It was that they never really learned how to see me in the first place. I wasn't difficult or rebellious. I was just intricate. My passions didn't translate into a neat headline for the family Christmas letter. I learned to live in the shadows, pouring everything into my books, my models, my designs. I found solace in the immutable laws of physics, in the honesty of a well-drawn line. A structure couldn't lie. A load-bearing wall either did its job or it failed. There was a purity to it that I couldn't find in human relationships. I figured if I couldn't be the daughter they celebrated, I'd be the daughter they couldn't function without. This dynamic solidified when we both chose our careers. Serena got a business degree from Wharton and became the perfect saleswoman, effortlessly charming clients and investors. I went to Columbia for a Master of Architecture, disappearing into the studio for days at a time, emerging with designs that were technically brilliant, but emotionally distant. It was Dad's idea to start the firm. "Vance and Vance Designs," he'd announced over dinner one night. "It's perfect. Serena, you're the face. Alara, you're the engine. Together, you're unstoppable." He saw it as a perfect business synergy, a merger of his two assets. He didn't see it as a family tragedy in the making. He was building a structure with a fatal design flaw, placing all the visible weight on one column while ignoring the one doing all the actual work. And I, desperate for his approval, for any kind of acknowledgement, agreed. I thought that by being the engine, I would finally prove my worth. I didn't realize that engines are meant to be hidden, kept in the basement, heard, but not seen. The Skybridge competition was supposed to change that. It was a design so audacious, so completely me, that I thought it would be impossible to hide the engineer this time. It would be my name, my vision, finally brought into the light. Vance and Vance Designs was built on a fragile truce. Serena's charm, my blueprints. It was a partnership that looked perfect on paper and was a slow-motion catastrophe in practice. From the outside, we were the toast of the New York architectural scene. Architectural Digest called us the double helix of modern design. Forbes did a 30 under 30 feature on Serena, with a picture of her leaning confidently against a drafting table, my pencil sketches artfully blurred in the background. The article mentioned me once as her talented younger sister and head of design. Our roles were defined from day one. Serena handled the clients, the press, the money. She could walk into a boardroom of hardened developers and walk out with a signed contract and a dinner invitation. She spoke the language of power and influence fluently. My fluency was in AutoCAD, in the properties of steel, in the silent conversation between a structure and the gravity it defied. I lived in the back office, a space Serena jokingly called the laboratory. It was my sanctuary and my prison, filled with foam core models, material samples, and the smell of coffee and fixation spray. Clients would meet with Serena in our pristine conference room. They'd be captivated by her vision, her passion, her vocabulary. She used words like dialogue, narrative, and experiential journey. She was selling a feeling, an idea. Then she would come back to my studio, close the door, and say, "Okay, they bought it. They want a 4-story atrium with a cantilevered glass staircase. Make it work." And I would. I would do the math. I would solve the engineering puzzles. I would spend 100 sleepless hours turning her poetic sales pitch into a buildable reality. And at the next client presentation, Serena would unveil my technical drawings as if she'd pulled them from her own mind, explaining the structural mechanics with a confidence she'd rehearsed from my notes the night before. Our parents enabled it, celebrated it. They were the primary investors in the firm. For them, this arrangement was ideal. Their golden child was the public face of success, and the quiet one was humming away productively in the background. "Serena has the business acumen," Dad would say, "and Alara has the technical skill. It's a perfect match." He said, technical skill, the way one might talk about a good plumber. Necessary, but not glamorous. There were times I tried to push back. During the pitch for the Blackwood Tower, I insisted on co-presenting. I had designed a novel facade system that mimicked the organic patterns of crystal formation, and I wanted to explain the science behind it. The meeting was a disaster. I was nervous, I used jargon, I got lost in the technical weeds. I could feel the client's eyes glazing over. Halfway through, Serena gracefully stepped in. She took my complex explanation and spun it into a beautiful, simple story about a building that grows toward the light. She saved the meeting, and we won the contract. That night she was gentle. "Ellie, you're a genius. You know that?" she said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "But you think in equations. People buy poetry. Let me be the poet. I let her. Because she was right, wasn't she? I retreated further into my work, convincing myself that the work itself was enough, that the silent respect of engineers and builders was more valuable than the applause of the crowd. I told myself that Serena needed me, and that was a form of power. But it was a lie. We weren't partners. I was a ghostwriter for a story she was telling about herself. Skybridge was meant to be my declaration, the one project so intrinsically tied to my unique philosophy that no one else could possibly narrate it. It was the book I had to publish under my own name. For 6 relentless months, I lived and breathed Skybridge. It wasn't a project. It was an obsession, a monastic devotion. I essentially moved into the studio, sleeping on a small cot in the corner, surrounded by sketches, models, and discarded coffee cups. My world shrank to the size of a drafting table. The city outside, the life I was supposed to be living at 28, all of it faded into a distant hum. My singular focus was on the problem of the museum, a problem I believed could only be solved by creating a new language of architecture. The concept of dynamic architecture came to me one night around 3 a.m., staring at a simulation of wind shear hitting a traditional cantilever. Static designs fought against nature. They resisted, they stood rigid, and under enough stress, they broke. What if a building didn't fight? What if it yielded? What if it could anticipate the forces acting upon it and adjust its own internal structure in real time, like a muscle tensing or a tree bending in the wind? That was the soul of the design. I envisioned a primary cantilever supported not by a single, massive, rigid beam, but by a complex internal network I called the kinetic armature. It was a system of interlocking trusses and supports, connected by sensors and micro-actuators. It would constantly make microscopic adjustments, redistributing the load across the structure's skeleton, channeling stress instead of absorbing it. The building would be alive. It would breathe. The main exhibition hall would feel like it was floating, untethered from the earth, a space of impossible lightness and strength. It was revolutionary, borderline insane from a traditional engineering standpoint, and the most beautiful thing I had ever conceived. Serena, to her credit, knew she had lightning in a bottle. She didn't understand the complex mathematics or the material science, but she understood the poetry. "A living building," she'd murmur, watching me work. "My God, Alara, that's the narrative. That's the headline." She became the project's fiercest protector and promoter, shielding me from all distractions. She handled the budgets, the consultants, the endless paperwork required for the competition entry. "You just focus on the genius part," she'd say with a wink, dropping another container of takeout on my desk. Our partnership seemed to find its equilibrium. I was the heart, and she was the shield. I worked in a fever dream of creation. I filled a dozen notebooks with calculations. I built a scale model with a functioning motorized armature that whirred softly in the corner of the studio. I spent days talking to material scientists at MIT about new composite alloys that were both flexible and stronger than steel. The design was more than just blueprints. It was a holistic philosophy that infused every detail, from the way the ventilation systems mimicked the respiratory system of an organism to the way the porous facade would collect and filter rainwater. 1 week before the submission deadline, it was done. A stack of drawings 2 inches thick, a detailed physical model, and a data drive containing terabytes of simulations. It was perfect. It was our victory. That final night, Serena and I stood in the quiet studio, looking at the model. The city lights twinkled outside. "We did it, Ellie," she said, her voice soft with a rare, unguarded awe. She put her arm around my shoulders. They're going to talk about this for 100 years. I leaned my head on her shoulder, exhausted and overwhelmed with a sense of shared triumph. For the first time, I felt like she saw me, not just my talent, but me. It was a powerful illusion. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at her future, a future she had just realized she didn't want to share. The call came 2 days later, on a Tuesday morning. It was from a nurse in my hometown. Dr. Alistair Finch, my old high school physics teacher and lifelong mentor, had suffered a massive stroke. He was in the ICU, and he was asking for me. The world tilted on its axis. Alistair wasn't just a teacher. He was the first person who had ever looked at one of my clumsy, ambitious drawings and seen an architect instead of a hobbyist. He was the one who taught me that the universe was governed by elegant, honest laws. He'd driven me to my Columbia interview. He'd sent me care packages during finals. He was more of a father to my mind than my own father had ever been. There was no question. I had to go. I found Serena in the conference room on a call with a potential lighting consultant. She saw the look on my face and immediately excused herself. I told her about Alistair, my voice shaking. I have to go home. Just for a few days. I can't not be there. Her face softened with a perfect, practiced empathy. She came over and wrapped me in a hug. Oh, Ellie, of course. Don't even think twice. Family, real family, comes first. You go. I'll handle everything here. But the submission, I stammered, my mind racing through the final checklist. The printing, the binding of the presentation books, the final courier delivery on Friday. Shh, she said, stroking my hair. I've got this. You've done all the heavy lifting. The masterpiece is finished. All that's left is putting it in the envelope. I will guard this with my life. I promise you. Just go be with Alistair. The relief was so immense it almost brought me to my knees. Of course Serena would handle it. She was the organized one, the responsible one. This was her domain. She walked me through the checklist herself, making notes on a legal pad. Okay, so final blueprints to be printed at Alpha Graphics, 3 bound copies of the project brief, digital files go on this drive, courier pickup at 4 p.m. on Friday. See? All under control. She smiled that reassuring, confident smile that had won us millions of dollars in contracts. The only thing you need to worry about is holding Alistair's hand. I packed a small bag in a daze, my mind torn between the sterile white of an ICU and the crisp white of our blueprints. Before I left the office, I paused at the door to the studio. My entire world was in that room. Serena, I said, a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. My name, on the title block. You'll make sure it's... She cut me off, her expression one of gentle offense. Elara Vance. Serena Vance. Vance and Vance. Of course. This is our dream, remember? She squeezed my arm. Now go. Call me when you get there. I believed her. I hugged her one last time, inhaling the scent of her perfume and ambition, and walked out the door. I left my soul on a drafting table in Soho and got on a train heading north, completely unaware that I wasn't just leaving a project behind. I was leaving my entire life in the hands of the one person who stood to gain the most by destroying it. I was so focused on the dying man who had taught me about the laws of physics that I forgot the first law of human nature. The vacuum of power is always filled. and I had just created a vacuum. I spent the next 3 days in a haze of antiseptic smells and the rhythmic beeping of machines. Alistair was there, but he wasn't. He was trapped behind a veil, his brilliant mind locked away. I sat by his bed, holding his cool, unresponsive hand, reading to him from a tattered copy of Carl Sagan's Cosmos that he'd given me for my 16th birthday. I spoke to him about Skybridge, about the kinetic armature, about how his lessons on stress and tension were embedded in its very steel. I updated Serena with brief, distracted texts. She always responded immediately. "Thinking of you both. Everything is on track here. Don't worry." Back in New York, Serena wasn't just keeping things on track. She was methodically derailing my life. The betrayal wasn't a crime of passion. It was a premeditated and flawlessly executed coup. Her first move was digital. That evening, after I left, she went into the server. She opened the master AutoCAD file for the Skybridge project. On the title block, in the bottom right-hand corner of every single drawing, were our names, as we'd always done it. Project Architect, Alara Vance. Principal in Charge, Serena Vance. With a few keystrokes, she deleted my name. She moved her name into the Project Architect slot, leaving the principal position tellingly vacant, as if it were a project she had single-handedly conceived and executed. She then saved the file, created a new set of PDFs, and deleted the original version from the server and the backup drive. The digital ghost of my authorship was gone. Her second move was physical. She took my notebooks, a dozen moleskins filled with every calculation, every frantic sketch, every seed of the dynamic architecture philosophy, and packed them into a box. She sealed it and put it in a private storage unit she rented under her name that afternoon. They were the only raw, handwritten proof of my creative process. Her third and most insidious move was the narrative. She didn't just steal the work. She assassinated my character to justify the theft. She called our parents. I can only imagine the tone she used, one of deep, sisterly concern, laced with performative sorrow. "I don't know what to do," I picture her saying, her voice cracking. "Alara's not well. She's been erratic, not sleeping for weeks. This morning she just snapped. She said the pressure was too much and walked out. She's abandoned the project just days before the deadline." She let that sink in. Then she delivered the masterstroke. She's blaming it on Alistair being sick, but it's more than that. She was talking about how the building was speaking to her. I'm scared for her. I think she's having some kind of breakdown. She knew exactly which buttons to push. My quiet intensity, my obsessive work habits, my artistic temperament, all the things my parents privately found odd about me, were now reframed as symptoms of instability. She was turning my greatest strength, my total immersion in my work, into a sign of madness. She was giving our parents a story that made sense to them, a story that cast Serena not as a thief, but as a hero, stepping up to save the family firm from her brilliant but unstable sister. It was a perfect, elegant, and utterly devastating lie. On Friday afternoon, while I was talking to Alistair's doctors about palliative care, Serena was at Alpha Graphics, printing out my life's work with only her name on it. She was binding the presentation books. At 4 p.m., she personally handed the package to the courier, sealing my fate with a smile. She had done exactly what she promised. She had guarded our dream with her life. She'd just decided it was only her dream now. The call came on a Tuesday night, a week after the submission. I was in Alistair's quiet, book-filled house, sorting through his papers, the scent of old pages and pipe tobacco thick in the air. The competition results were due to be announced any day, and a nervous, hopeful energy was thrumming just beneath the surface of my grief. My phone buzzed, displaying Dad. I smiled, thinking it was a call to check in, a rare moment of parental concern. I was a fool. "Hello," I answered, my voice bright. "Alara." His voice was flat, cold. It was his boardroom voice, the one he used for hostile negotiations. The sound of it froze the air in my lungs. "Serena told us you were back at Alistair's." "I am," I said, confused. "His funeral is on Thursday. I was going to call you tonight. Have you heard anything from the guild?" There was a pause, heavy and deliberate. "We have. Serena called an hour ago. Vance and Vance won." For a second, pure joy eclipsed the coldness in his tone. "Oh my God, we won? Dad, we actually won!" I sank into Alistair's worn armchair, laughing with relief. "I can't believe it." "There is no we, Alara," he said, and the words were like shards of glass. "Serena won. Her name, and only her name, is on that project. She told us everything." The room began to spin. "What? What are you talking about? That's impossible. My name is on every drawing." "Don't lie to me," he snapped, and the civility was gone, replaced by a raw, guttural anger I hadn't heard since I was a child. "Your sister showed us the final submission files. She told us how you abandoned the firm at the most critical moment, how you buckled under the pressure and left her to pick up the pieces, how you had the gall to demand credit for the work you walked away from." I felt my throat tighten, a band of pure, sickening disbelief. "Dad, that's not true. I went to take care of Alistair. Serena told me she would handle the submission. She promised me." "Oh, so now you're blaming your sister?" he said, his voice dripping with disgust. "The one who worked 48 hours straight to salvage this project after you fell apart? The one who is trying to protect this family, our investment, from your instability?" Instability. The word hit me like a physical blow. It was Serena's word. My father was using Serena's word. The lie was complete. It had been absorbed into the family bloodstream. "Dad, please listen to me," I begged, my voice cracking. "I can prove it. The server logs, the early drafts, my notebooks." "Enough," he commanded. The word was a guillotine. "Serena told us you'd have a story ready. She said you'd try to manipulate us. I will not have it. You have embarrassed this family for the last time. You have jeopardized the single biggest opportunity this firm has ever had with your selfishness and your drama." My mother came on the line then, her voice a reedy, trembling echo of my father's fury. "How could you do this to your sister, Alara? After everything we've done for you?" "Mom, it's a lie," I sobbed, tears streaming down my face. "Please, you have to believe me." "Believe you?" Dad was back, his voice a roar. "We saw the proof, Alara. We saw the final documents. Do not call this house again. Do not contact us. Do not contact your sister. You are no longer associated with Vance and Vance, and you are no longer our concern." The line went dead. I sat there, in the crushing silence of a dead man's study, the phone still pressed to my ear. 4 minutes and 12 seconds. That's how long the trial and execution had taken. I had been judged, sentenced, and erased by my own family based on a lie I didn't even know had been told. A text message lit up my phone screen a minute later. It was from Serena. "I'm so sorry it had to be this way, Ellie. I had to protect the firm. They needed to hear it from me. Get some help. We'll talk when you're better." She wasn't sorry. She had just consolidated her empire, and she'd signed off with a diagnosis. I was 28 years old. I had just won the most prestigious architectural competition in a generation, and I had just become no one's daughter. In the hollowed-out aftermath of that phone call, a desperate, frantic energy took hold. I was an architect. My entire life was about evidence, about proof, about the verifiable logic of structures. Surely, this was just a catastrophic misunderstanding. Surely, if I could just present them with the evidence, the truth would prevail. From a desolate motel room off I-95, with the hum of the ice machine outside my door as my only companion, I mounted my defense. Over the next 5 days, I waged a one-woman war against a wall of absolute silence. I called my parents' house 14 times. The first 3 calls rang until they went to voicemail, where I left rambling, tearful messages, begging them to just listen. By the 4th call, the line had a different tone, a series of beeps. They had blocked my number. I tried my mother's cell, blocked. I moved to email. I wrote a long, meticulous message, a legal brief of my own life. I laid out the timeline of the project, the genesis of the dynamic architecture concept, the dates and times of my work. I attached early drafts of the design from months ago, files that were time-stamped, irrefutable proof that the core concepts were mine. I attached a photo of my physical model. I gave them the names of the MIT consultants I'd worked with. I gave them everything a rational person would need to see the truth. I pressed send and waited, staring at my laptop screen, my heart pounding with a wild hope. No response. The next day, I wrote another email, this one to my mother. It wasn't about the project. It was a plea. "Mom, I don't understand. I'm your daughter. How can you not even listen to me? Please, just call me. I'm scared." The email didn't bounce back. It was just consumed by the void. I wrote a physical letter, my hands shaking so badly the words were barely legible. I put everything in it. Printouts of the early drawings, a copy of a note Alistair had written me about the design, calling it a work of pure genius, Alara. I paid extra for priority mail and tracking. 5 days later, it came back to the motel. A brutal red stamp across the front. Return to sender. I recognized my mother's elegant looping script in the "refused" written on the envelope. She hadn't even opened it. My last resort was Aunt Carol, my mother's younger sister. She had always been the one person in the family who treated me not as an oddity, but as an individual. She lived in California, removed from the daily psychodrama of the Vance family. I called her, my voice hoarse from crying and not sleeping. I told her everything. She was silent for a long time, and then she sighed, a sound heavy with a weary resignation. "Oh, honey, this is just... It's Richard and Eleanor all over again," she said. "They build a narrative, and they defend it like a fortress." She promised she would call them. She called me back an hour later. Her voice was strained. "He hung up on me, Alara," she said softly. "Your father told me that you were unstable, and that I was enabling your delusions. He said the family was handling it and that I needed to stay out of it. 5 days, 14 calls, 2 emails, 1 letter, 1 intermediary. Every single attempt at communication was rejected, blocked, or returned unopened. And then, the final, crushing realization settled in. This wasn't a new betrayal. This was the culmination of my entire life. Every science fair they missed, every parent-teacher conference they sent Serena to in their place, every time Serena's version of a childhood argument was accepted as fact, while mine was dismissed as Alara being dramatic. This was just the final, loudest, most absolute iteration of a pattern that had been set in stone since I was born. On the 6th day, sitting in that stale motel room, I stopped trying. Not because I had given up on the truth, but because I realized they had. They hadn't been convinced by a lie. They had been given an excuse, a convenient story that affirmed everything they already believed. Serena hadn't just stolen a building. She had given my parents permission to finally stop pretending they had 2 daughters. New York was a city of ghosts. Every corner held a memory, every skyscraper a silent judgment. The skyline I had once dreamed of shaping now felt like a wall, locking me out. I had to leave. With less than $1,000 to my name and a reputation that was now toxic, I bought a one-way bus ticket to Chicago. Why Chicago? It was the birthplace of the modern skyscraper, a city built on architectural ambition. But it wasn't my city. It was anonymous. It was a place where no one knew the name Alara Vance, or if they did, it was only as a whispered cautionary tale. I arrived with 1 suitcase and the crushing weight of my own failure. The first few months were a blur of survival. I rented a tiny 3rd-floor walk-up in a neighborhood that smelled of damp brick and despair. I sold my laptop, the one I'd used to design Skybridge, for rent money. I found a job waiting tables at a greasy spoon diner, my architect's hands, once steady enough to draw a perfectly straight line, now shaking as I poured coffee for tired truck drivers. At night, I'd lie awake, staring at the water-stained ceiling, and the blueprints would play out in my mind. Not Skybridge, my own life. I'd deconstruct it, trying to find the exact point of structural failure. The shame was a physical presence, a heavy coat I couldn't take off. I had been declared unstable, unreliable. I imagined what people in New York were saying. Did you hear about Alara Vance? Such a shame. A brilliant mind, but she just couldn't handle the pressure. Serena's lie was so effective because it was so plausible. A perfect story for a male-dominated industry that had always been suspicious of intense, uncompromising women. My re-entry into the world of architecture was humiliatingly small. I saw a flyer on a community bulletin board. A family needed someone to design a back porch for their bungalow. I took the job. For $100, I spent a weekend measuring, sketching, and building a small model out of popsicle sticks and glue. The work was grounding. It was real. There was no glory, no press releases, just the simple, honest problem of wood and load and function. The family loved it. They paid me in cash and gave me a plate of cookies. It was the first time in months I felt a flicker of my old self. That small job led to another, a kitchen renovation, a garage conversion. I was a ghost architect, working for cash, my name never appearing on any official documents. I was building, but I was invisible. I haunted construction sites, learning the trades from the ground up. I learned about plumbing, about electrical, about the gritty, unglamorous reality of how buildings actually come together. I wasn't designing monuments to the future anymore. I was preserving the past, finding the beauty in old brick, in weathered timber, in the flawed, resilient structures that had withstood the test of time. I was living a life that was the polar opposite of the one I'd been destined for. It was a universe away from the gleaming towers and gala openings of New York. But in the dust and grime of these forgotten buildings, something began to shift. I was no longer surrounded by people who valued poetry over physics. I was with people who valued what was real, what was strong, what worked. They didn't care about my name or my family. They cared if my lines were true and if my structures would stand. And in that brutal, unforgiving honesty, I began, brick by painstaking brick, to rebuild my own foundation. It was in the dusty, anonymous world of Chicago's forgotten buildings that I found my true allies. They didn't appear all at once in some cinematic flourish. They revealed themselves slowly, drawn not to a reputation, but to the quiet integrity of the work itself. The first was Arthur Kowalski. I met him on a gut renovation of a 1920s library in Pilsen. The city had hired a big-name firm to handle the redesign, but they'd subcontracted the tricky structural reinforcement to Arthur's small, independent engineering consultancy. I was on site as a freelance drafter for the general contractor, a nameless cog in a big machine. One afternoon, I was looking at the original, century-old blueprints, marveling at the elegant, over-engineered steelwork. The main contractor wanted to rip out a set of original riveted beams to make way for an HVAC system, proposing a simple, modern I-beam as a replacement. It was cheaper, but it was ugly, and it didn't respect the building's history. On my own time, I sketched an alternative, a suspended support system that would bypass the beams entirely, preserving their aesthetic integrity while actually improving the load distribution. It was an unnecessarily complex solution for a job I wasn't even being paid to engineer. I left the sketch on the site manager's desk, unsigned. The next day, a mountain of a man with a thick white mustache and hands like worn leather approached me. "UEV?" he grumbled, holding up my sketch. I tensed, ready to be fired for overstepping. "I'm Arthur Kowalski," he said, tapping a thick finger on a detail in my drawing. "This truss connection. It's unconventional, but it's bloody brilliant. Disperses the torsional load in a way I haven't seen since Fazlur Khan was playing with bundled tubes. Who the hell taught you to draw like that?" I mumbled something about my education. I didn't tell him my name. He didn't ask again. He just grunted, "You're wasted drawing up change orders for morons." A week later, he offered me a job, not as a drafter, but as a consulting designer. He'd bring me the problems no one else wanted to solve: buildings that were sinking, facades that were crumbling, foundations that were failing. He'd hand me a set of impossible constraints, and I'd give him back an elegant, improbable solution. He never asked about my past. He saw the work, and for him, that was enough. He was the mentor Alistair had been, reincarnated in the form of a gruff, 70-year-old structural engineer. He didn't just give me a job, he gave me back my language. Julia Chen found me a year later. She was an investigative journalist for a niche online magazine that focused on long-form pieces about power and fraud in the arts and architecture worlds. She called me out of the blue. "Am I speaking with EV?" she asked, her voice sharp and intelligent. Arthur had given her my number. "I'm doing a piece on the 5-year anniversary of the Skybridge competition," she said, and my blood ran cold. I was a junior reporter covering the announcement back then. I always thought it was strange. Vance and Vance was a two-person show, but then one of the Vances just vanished. The official story was a nervous breakdown, but it never sat right with me. It was too neat, too convenient. We met in a coffee shop. I was terrified, ready to deny everything. But she didn't interrogate me. She just listened. She had a journalist's eye for the gaps in a story. "A talent like yours doesn't just evaporate," she said, stirring her tea. "It goes somewhere. It changes its name. I've been following your work here, the quiet stuff, the restorations. I see a signature, a certain kind of structural poetry, and I have a hunch it's the same signature that wrote Skybridge." I didn't confirm or deny anything. I just sat there, silent. As she left, she slid a business card across the table. "I believe that good stories, like good buildings, need a solid foundation in the truth," she said. "If you ever decide you want to tell yours, I promise I'll build it to last." I kept the card. For 2 years it sat in my wallet, a silent promise that I wasn't the only one who suspected the world was built on a lie. Under the shelter of Arthur's mentorship and Julia's quiet conviction, I began to build again. Not just buildings, but a self. The name EV became my shield and my brand. It stood for Alara Vance, a secret I kept close to my chest, but it also came to stand for something more. Engineering veracity, ethical vision. It was a quiet rebellion against the world of empty poetry I had left behind. My design philosophy, born in the ashes of Skybridge, was its antithesis. Where Skybridge was about a sleek, flawless, untouchable perfection, my new work was about resilience. I was inspired by the Japanese art of kintsugi, the practice of repairing broken pottery with gold, celebrating the cracks as part of the object's history. I began to specialize in adaptive reuse, taking old, abandoned warehouses, factories, and churches and breathing new life into them. I didn't erase their history. I highlighted it. I exposed old brick walls, left weathered steel beams in place, and designed modern interventions that were in conversation with the building's past, not in opposition to it. My work wasn't flashy. It didn't scream for attention from the cover of a magazine. It whispered. It was about the texture of materials, the quality of light in a forgotten corner, the honest expression of a structural joint. While Serena was giving keynote speeches about narrative, I was on my hands and knees on a construction site, feeling the grain of 100-year-old floorboard. Arthur and I became a formidable team. We developed a reputation in Chicago and across the Midwest as the people you called when a project was deemed impossible. We saved a historic theater from demolition by designing an exoskeleton that supported the crumbling facade while a new structure was built inside. We converted a derelict grain silo into a stunning residential complex, using its circular form to create unique, light-filled apartments. Each project was a quiet act of defiance. Each building that stood, solid and true, was a counter-argument to the lie that I was unstable. My revenge wasn't a plot. It was a portfolio. I poured all the pain, all the anger, all the grief into my work. A client once told me, "Your buildings feel honest. They feel like they've lived a life." It was the greatest compliment I could have received. Julia would check in periodically. She never pushed, but she was always watching. "Your name is getting around," she told me over the phone one day. "People are talking about EV. They say the work has a kind of soul that's been missing from mainstream architecture." She was building her case, slowly, meticulously, like a good journalist does. She gathered evidence of my Chicago projects, cross-referencing their structural ingenuity with the few early uncredited design concepts from my time at Vance & Vance that had leaked online before being scrubbed. She was tracing the architectural DNA. I never let myself think about Skybridge. I built a wall around that memory. It was a part of my life that was over, a name that belonged to someone else. I convinced myself that this new life, this quiet, honest work, was enough. I had the respect of my peers, a small but thriving business, and the satisfaction of creating things that were real and lasting. I told myself I didn't need the fame, the recognition, the name. I was EV now. Alara Vance was a ghost. And I was content to let her rest. But ghosts have a habit of not staying buried, especially when their foundations are built on a lie. 5 years to the month after I'd been exiled, the call came. It was a Tuesday evening in November. I was in my small but light-filled apartment in Chicago, sketching ideas for a community arts center. Hippo, my scruffy terrier mix I'd named after Hippodamus of Miletus, the father of urban planning, was asleep at my feet. My life was quiet, stable, and entirely my own. The phone rang, displaying Arthur's name. It was late for him to call. "Alara," he said, and his voice was different. The usual gruffness was gone, replaced by a low, urgent intensity. "Are you watching the news?" "No, I'm working. What's wrong?" "Turn on CNN, right now." I picked up the remote, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. The screen flickered to life, showing an aerial shot of a familiar sweeping structure, gleaming under the afternoon sun. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, "Cracks in a landmark. NYC's Skybridge Museum faces structural crisis." My breath caught in my throat. A reporter was standing on the far side of the river, the museum a stark, beautiful sculpture behind her. "Engineers discovered what they are calling a significant hairline fracture in the primary cantilever during a routine ultrasonic scan," she was saying. "While officials insist there is no immediate danger to the public, the museum has been closed indefinitely, pending a full investigation. The firm that designed the building, Vance & Vance, led by star architect Serena Vance." The camera cut to a shot of Serena at a press conference from earlier that day. She looked older, her face tight with a carefully managed smile. She was projecting an aura of calm control, but I could see the panic in her eyes. It was the same look she'd had in high school when she'd been caught cheating on a history exam. "This is an incredibly complex structure," Arthur's voice crackled over the phone. "They're bringing in everyone. Thornton Tomasetti, Arup, the best of the best. They're all stumped. They think it's a material fatigue issue, but the numbers don't add up. The alloy in that cantilever is supposed to have a 100-year lifespan." "It's not the alloy," I whispered, my eyes glued to the screen, to the diagrams showing the location of the crack. I could see it. I could feel it from 500 miles away. The stress point. The place where the elegant, complex dance of my kinetic armature was supposed to have performed its magic. "I know it's not," Arthur said, his voice grim. "I pulled the public record blueprints Serena filed with the city 5 years ago. I've been comparing them to the early concept sketches I found in an old architectural journal, the ones you worked on. She didn't just take your name off, Alara. She changed the design." "The armature," I said, my voice flat. "She ripped the guts out of it," he confirmed. "She replaced your dynamic truss network with a simplified, rigid support box. It's cheaper, easier to fabricate, and 1,000 times dumber. She kept the beautiful, thin profile of your cantilever, but she removed the very mechanism that made it possible. She built a swan's neck on a crow's skeleton. It was bound to fail. It was just a matter of when. Silence stretched between us. The reporter was now interviewing a flustered city official. Hippo whined softly, nudging my hand with his nose. "They're convening an emergency summit next week," Arthur said quietly. "Invitation only. They're looking for specialists in structural failure and complex materials. They asked me to recommend anyone I knew. I gave them a name. E.V. I told them she was the only person in the country who could solve this." The room felt very cold. The past wasn't just a ghost anymore. It was a structural failure. It was a crisis. And it was an invitation. "They'll know who I am," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Yes," Arthur said. "That's the point." Returning to New York was like stepping into my own tomb. The city hadn't changed, but I had. As the train pulled into Penn Station, I saw the skyline, pierced by the familiar silhouettes of buildings I had studied, revered, and once dreamed of adding to. Now, among them, was Skybridge, a monument to my erasure. But the dread I expected to feel was muted, replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. I wasn't the broken 28-year-old girl who had fled on a bus in the middle of the night. I was a 33-year-old expert, summoned to diagnose a disease I had predicted 5 years ago. I checked into a hotel in the meatpacking district, a sleek, anonymous place of concrete and glass. Julia met me in the lobby. She'd flown in from D.C. Her eyes were bright with the thrill of the story, but also with a quiet, fierce loyalty. "You ready for this?" she asked, sliding a folder across the table. "No," I said honestly, "but it doesn't matter." The folder contained her ammunition. For years, she had been building this case, and now it was ready. Inside were printouts of the early concept art from Vance & Vance, clearly showing the kinetic armature. There were sworn affidavits from 2 junior architects who had worked at the firm back then, both of whom remembered my all-consuming work on the project and Serena's peripheral role. There was a detailed technical analysis, co-written with a professor from MIT, comparing my original philosophy with Serena's simplified, filed blueprints. And there was the centerpiece, a transcript of a recorded interview with Alistair Finch, taken a year before he died. In it, he spoke with lucid pride about his former student, Alara Vance, and the revolutionary living building concept she had described to him in painstaking detail just days before her name disappeared from the world. "It's a bomb, Alara," Julia said, her voice low, "and it's ready to go off. I just need you to tell me when to light the fuse." "At the summit," I said, "when I'm presenting. I want them to hear the truth from me first. Then I want the world to see the proof." The day of the summit was gray and cold. I dressed carefully, not in the functional, unassuming clothes of E.V., the Chicago restorer, but in the armor of Alara Vance, the New York architect. A sharply tailored black suit, heels that made a decisive sound on marble floors, and my hair pulled back in a severe, uncompromising knot. I was a ghost, but I was dressing for a resurrection. Walking into the grand hall of the Architectural Guild felt surreal. The room was buzzing with the hushed, anxious energy of the world's top engineers and architects. I saw faces I recognized from magazines, legends of the industry. They all wore badges that said their name and affiliation. My badge, printed at the registration desk just moments before, felt heavy, momentous. It read, E.V., Structural Consultant. I saw them before they saw me. They were sitting in the front row, the tragic royal family. my father looking stately and grave, my mother exuding an air of pained elegance, and Serena. She was at the center of a small group, holding court, her expression a careful mask of concern and resolve. She looked every bit the celebrated architect, the leader navigating a crisis. Then her eyes swept the room, and for a fraction of a second, they met mine. There was no recognition. To her, I was just another anonymous consultant, another face in the crowd. The ghost was still invisible. The thought should have hurt, but it didn't. It was an advantage. I took a seat in the back, opened my laptop, and began my final review of the data. The presentation was in 2 hours. I wasn't just there to present a theory. I was there to perform an autopsy, and the body on the table was my sister's career. The first 2 hours of the summit were a masterclass in high-level floundering. One by one, celebrated engineers from global firms presented their findings. They showed complex slides on material stress, ultrasonic scans, and atmospheric corrosion. They used phrases like anomalous propagation and unforeseen resonance. They were all brilliant, and they were all wrong. They were trying to diagnose a disease by looking at the symptoms without ever understanding the patient's anatomy. I sat in the back, listening, my own presentation loaded on a flash drive in my pocket. My turn was scheduled for last, the independent consultant, the wild card. Finally, the moderator, a stern-faced woman from the guild, cleared her throat. And for our final presentation, we have a specialist in structural integrity and material failure who comes highly recommended. Please welcome E.V. I stood up and walked toward the stage. The click of my heels on the floor seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence. As I passed the front row, my father glanced at me, a flicker of irritation on his face, as if annoyed by the interruption. Serena didn't even look up. She was texting on her phone. I reached the podium, adjusted the microphone, and plugged in my drive. My first slide appeared on the enormous screen behind me. It wasn't a graph or a chart. It was a simple, elegant, hand-drawn sketch of the kinetic armature, pulled from one of my old notebooks. The problem with the Skybridge Museum is not in its materials, I began, my voice clear and steady, amplified throughout the hall. It is in its philosophy. That's when Serena looked up. Her eyes, drawn by the familiar lines of the sketch, lifted from her phone and met mine. And in that moment, the ghost became flesh. I watched a series of emotions cascade across her face, a 5-act play in 5 seconds. First, confusion. Who is this woman? Why does she have my... Then, a jolt of dawning recognition, a flicker of a memory from a lifetime ago. Then, pure, unadulterated shock as her brain connected the face of the woman on stage with the sister she had buried. Then, her face went white with terror, the blood draining away so fast she seemed to shrink in her chair. Finally, the mask slammed back down, a desperate attempt at composure that fooled no one. My father had turned in his seat, his mouth slightly agape. He was staring at me, his eyes wide with disbelief. My mother's hand flew to her pearls, her carefully constructed poise shattering like cheap glass. I ignored them. I looked out at the audience of my peers. "My name is Alara Vance," I said, and a shocked murmur rippled through the room. And 5 years ago, I was the project architect of the original Skybridge design, the design that was stolen from me. I clicked to the next slide. It showed a side-by-side comparison. My original design for the armature on the left, and the simplified, filed for permit version on the right. "This," I said, pointing to my design, is a dynamic load-bearing system designed to breathe. It redistributes stress in real time. This, I moved the laser pointer to Serena's version, is a rigid, hollow box. It is a cheap imitation that maintains the aesthetic profile of the original, but ignores the fundamental physics that made it possible. It is a sarcophagus, beautiful on the outside, but dead within. I walked them through the data, the stress simulations, the material science. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The truth was cold, hard, and irrefutable. The crack you are seeing is not a failure of material, I concluded, my eyes finding Serena's in the front row. It is a failure of integrity. The building is not breaking. It is suffocating. It is tearing itself apart because the person who built it never understood its soul. As I spoke the final words of my presentation, a new sound began to fill the hall. It started quietly, a few scattered buzzes and pings, then grew into a chorus. Heads that had been rapt, focused on the stage, were now dipping down to look at glowing phone screens. A wave of agitated whispers spread through the room like wildfire. I knew what was happening. Julia had lit the fuse. I took a deliberate step back from the podium, my work done. On the massive screen behind me, I left my final slide displayed, a scan from Alistair Finch's sworn statement. The kinetic armature was Alara's soul rendered in steel, a work of pure genius. In the front row, Serena's face had crumpled. The terror had been replaced by the vacant, hollowed-out look of someone watching their own world burn to the ground on 100 tiny screens simultaneously. My father had his phone out. I watched him read, his face turning a blotchy, unhealthy shade of red. My mother seemed frozen, her eyes darting between me on the stage and her husband's horrified expression, unable to comprehend the scale of the disaster unfolding. Julia's article was a masterpiece of journalistic annihilation. The headline was simple and devastating. The Architect of Skybridge: How Serena Vance Built a Career on Her Sister's Stolen Blueprints. The article laid out the entire 5-year deception, piece by damning piece. It had everything. The time-stamped digital drafts of my work, the testimony from the junior architects, the expert analysis from the MIT professor, confirming that the file design was a structurally illiterate simplification of the original concept. It had excerpts from Alistair's interview. It even had a quote from a disgruntled former IT technician at Vance & Vance, who confirmed that the server logs from the week of the submission had been professionally wiped. And it had the human story. Julia had found the old motel owner where I had stayed after being cast out. He remembered the sad, quiet girl who cried for a week straight and kept getting mail returned to her. She had found my Aunt Carol, who confirmed on the record that my father had hung up on her when she tried to intervene. The story wasn't just about stolen blueprints anymore. It was about a calculated, cruel, and systematic erasure of a human being, perpetrated by her own sister and enabled by her own parents. The narrative that Serena had so carefully crafted for 5 years was being publicly dismantled, line by line, in front of the entire architectural world. The moderator, looking stunned, tried to regain control of the room. "Thank you, Ms. Vance. We will now open the floor for questions," but no one was listening. A reporter from the New York Times was already on his feet, his phone held up like a weapon. "Serena Vance," he shouted, "do you have a comment on the allegations in this article? Did you steal the Skybridge design from your sister?" Serena didn't move. She just stared blankly ahead. My father stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair. He grabbed my mother's arm and, without a single glance in my direction, began pulling her toward the exit, pushing through the swarm of reporters that was now descending on the front row. They were no longer the proud benefactors. They were fugitives, fleeing the scene of a crime they had financed. I stood on the stage and watched the chaos. I felt no triumph, no joy, just a quiet, hollow calm. The truth wasn't a celebration. It was a demolition. And the rubble of my family's reputation was lying at my feet. The aftermath was not a slow burn. It was a detonation. By the time I left the guild hall, flanked by a security guard the organizers had hired to shield me from the press, my life had been irrevocably altered. My phone, which had been silent for 5 years, was now a constant, vibrating source of chaos. Emails from every major news outlet, texts from cousins and old family friends, all saying some version of, "I am so, so sorry." Voicemails from architects I had admired my entire life, offering their support and their outrage. The consequences for Serena and my parents were swift and brutal. The board of the Skybridge Museum announced an emergency meeting that very evening. By morning, a press release was issued. Serena Vance and the firm of Vance & Vance Designs were fired from the project, effective immediately. The city announced a full investigation into the bidding and design process, with the threat of legal action for fraud hanging heavy in the air. The feature profiles in Architectural Digest and Forbes vanished from their websites. Serena's speaking engagements were canceled. Her name, once a byword for visionary success, became a synonym for deceit. She went from icon to pariah in less than 12 hours. 2 days later, I was summoned to a meeting in the mayor's office. It was a room I had only ever seen on television, high up in City Hall, with imposing portraits of past mayors staring down from the walls. The mayor, the president of the Architectural Guild, and the chair of the museum's board were all there. They looked exhausted and deeply embarrassed. They apologized. They apologized for their lack of oversight, for being so thoroughly duped, for the injustice I had suffered. Then they made me an offer. "The building is a marvel, Ms. Vance," the board chair said, his voice heavy with sincerity. "Even with its flaw, it is a landmark. But its flaw is a direct result of its original vision being compromised. There is only one person in the world who can fix it. Only one person who has the moral and technical authority to see it through to its proper completion." They offered me the contract. Full and total control of the Skybridge Museum restoration and redesign project, an unlimited budget, a hand-picked team of my own choosing. They were not just offering me a job. They were offering me my legacy back, gift-wrapped in a public act of contrition. I should have felt elated, vindicated, triumphant. But as I sat in that stately office, looking out at the city that had once cast me out, I just felt tired. I had won. The truth had won. But the victory felt like standing alone on a battlefield, surrounded by the wreckage of a war I never wanted to fight. "Yes," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I'll do it, but on my terms." My first term was non-negotiable. The project would no longer be known as the Skybridge Museum. Its new official name, to be carved into the marble facade, would be the Finch Vance Museum, in honor of the one man who had believed in the vision from the very beginning. My second term was that Arthur Kowalski would be named the lead structural engineer, and my third term was that the full story of the design's origin would be a permanent part of the museum's exhibit. There would be no more ghosts, no more erased histories. The building itself would tell the truth. They agreed to everything without hesitation. As I left City Hall, I didn't feel like a victor. I felt like a survivor, tasked with rebuilding a beautiful, broken thing that should never have been broken in the first place. In the weeks that followed, I watched the collapse of my family's world from a clinical distance. I didn't take their calls. I didn't answer their frantic texts. I had my lawyer communicate with theirs. I was insulated by the whirlwind of my new role, buried in schematics, material requisitions, and team building. My days were spent on site at the silent, empty museum, walking its vast halls with Arthur, planning the delicate surgery we were about to perform. The work was my shield. The silence from the Vance house in Greenwich was, according to Aunt Carol, a living death. My parents had become recluses. Dad, a man whose entire identity was built on his reputation in the development community, had resigned from every board he sat on. He was facing potential lawsuits from his fellow investors in the project. Mom, a pillar of the local social scene, had stopped going to the country club, stopped hosting her charity luncheons. The shame was too great. Their friends, the same people who had toasted Serena's success, now crossed the street to avoid them. The perfect facade they had spent a lifetime constructing had crumbled into dust. Serena was in even worse shape. Her fiancé, a private equity executive she was supposed to marry that spring, left her. The Architectural Guild began proceedings to revoke her license. She was facing personal lawsuits and possible criminal charges for fraud. Aunt Carol told me Serena hadn't left the house in weeks, that she just sat in her room, staring at the walls. The poet had run out of words. There was a part of me, a small, dark, and long-suppressed part, that took a grim satisfaction in this. It was the simple, brutal physics of cause and effect, a law as immutable as gravity. They had built a structure on a lie, and it had collapsed, just as I knew it would. But mostly, I just felt a profound, aching sadness. I had wanted them to see me, to acknowledge the truth. I had never wanted to destroy them. I would walk through the empty museum, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous space, and I would see ghosts. Not my own ghost, but theirs. I'd see a ghost of my father, proudly cutting a ribbon, a ghost of my mother, smiling for the cameras at the opening gala that never was, a ghost of Serena, accepting an award at a podium. These were the things they had valued more than me, and now they were all gone. One evening, Arthur and I was standing on the cantilever, looking out at the glittering lights of Manhattan. The sun had just set, and the sky was a deep, bruised purple. "You know," he said, not looking at me, "the hardest part of reinforcing an old building isn't the new steel you put in. It's dealing with the rot you find in the old walls." He was right. I had exposed the rot. I had cut it out. But now, I was left with a hollow space where a family used to be. I had my name back. I had my building back. I had my truth. But I was standing in the ruins, and I didn't know if anything could be built there again. I had become the architect of their destruction, and it was a lonely, drafty masterpiece. 3 months into the restoration project, the first letter arrived. It was handwritten on my mother's heavy, cream-colored stationery. It was followed by an email from my father's lawyer to mine, formally requesting a meeting. For weeks, I ignored them. I let them sit in the void they had created for me 5 years earlier. I was in control now. The power dynamic had been irrevocably altered, and I needed them to understand the new architecture of our relationship before any conversation could begin. Finally, I agreed. Not at their house, not at my apartment. A neutral space. A sterile, soulless coffee shop in a midtown hotel lobby. A place with no memories. I saw them before they saw me. They were sitting at a small table, looking old and diminished. My father's confident posture was gone, replaced by a weary slump. My mother was wringing her hands, her face a mess of anxiety. They both looked up as I approached, their eyes filled with a desperate, pleading hope. I didn't sit down. "Before we say anything," I began, my voice calm and even, the voice of a surgeon before a difficult operation. "You need to understand the terms. This is not a negotiation. It's not a conversation. It is me telling you what happens next." My father opened his mouth, the old reflex to take charge, then closed it. He just nodded. "First, forgiveness is not on the table," I said. "Not today, not tomorrow. It is not something you can ask for or earn. If it ever comes, it will be on my own timeline, in my own way. Do you understand?" My mother choked back a sob and nodded. "Second, you will issue a public apology. Not a vague statement about regret, but a detailed, specific admission of fact. You will state that you chose to believe Serena's lie without question. You will state that you refused to look at my evidence. You will state that you cut your daughter off based on a fabrication. You will do this because the world that watched my humiliation needs to watch my public vindication, funded and signed by you." My father's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. "Third," I continued, "you will both go to therapy, not to fix us, to fix yourselves. You need to understand the pathology within this family that allowed you to so easily sacrifice one child for the other. You need to understand why the appearance of success was more important to you than the truth. I will not be part of any future that does not include a deep, professional excavation of that rot." They sat in silence, the weight of my terms settling over them. It was my mother who spoke first, her voice a raw whisper. "And Serena?" I had thought about this for 100 sleepless nights. What did justice for Serena look like? "I will meet with Serena," I said, "alone. But my relationship with her, whatever it may become, is separate from this. It is a different broken structure, and it will require its own set of blueprints." I looked at them, really looked at them, for the first time in 5 years. I didn't see monsters. I saw two weak, flawed people who had failed a fundamental test of parenthood. "That's it," I said. "Those are the foundations. You can either accept them, and we can see if something can be built here, or you can reject them, and I will walk out that door and you will never see me again. The choice is yours." My father, a man who had never once in his life admitted he was wrong, looked at my mother, then back at me. His eyes were glistening. "We accept," he said, his voice cracking. "We accept all of it." I am standing on the exposed steel of the kinetic armature. Below me, the East River is a ribbon of choppy gray, and the city I once fled sprawls out in every direction. It's been a year since the summit, a year of demolition and reconstruction, both architectural and emotional. The museum, my museum, is being reborn. Arthur is beside me, pointing out a newly installed network of sensors, the building's new nervous system. My team, the one I handpicked, moves with a quiet, confident energy below us. We are not just repairing a building, we are healing it. My parents kept their word. The public apology was printed in the New York Times, a full page of excruciating, detailed truth. They started therapy. My mother calls me once a week, tentatively, to report on her progress as if it's a homework assignment. Our conversations are stilted, awkward, but they are real. My father sends emails. They are short, factual, and devoid of the old bluster. He tells me about his sessions, about the things he's learning about his own pride. He is a man deconstructing himself, bolt by painful bolt. I met with Serena 6 months ago. She was a ghost of her former self, the brilliant charm extinguished, leaving behind something fragile and raw. We didn't yell. We just sat in a quiet room while she told me the truth I already knew, that she was jealous, that my quiet, certain genius terrified her, that she saw Skybridge as her one chance to finally be the substance, not just the style. She is facing her legal battles alone. She is working to get her license back, starting from the very bottom. Her sentence is to live a life outside the spotlight she craved so desperately. Maybe one day she will be my sister again. But for now, she is just a woman I used to know, who is trying to build something real for the first time in her life. On my desk in the site office, there is a letter. It arrived this morning on my mother's cream-colored stationery. I recognize the trembling handwriting. I know it is an invitation of some kind, a first, hesitant step towards something that might one day resemble a family. I haven't opened it yet. I look up from the armature, toward the sky. I came back to New York to fix a building. I thought that was the job. But I see now that the real project was this: to stand here, in the heart of my creation, with the wind on my face, and feel no anger, no bitterness, just the quiet, solid strength of a structure that was built to last. I have my name. I have my work. I have my truth. The foundation is sound. I placed the letter from my parents on my desk, unopened for now. The reconstruction of my masterpiece was complete. As for the reconstruction of my family, I would be the one to draw the blueprints, and I would decide when it was time to break ground. When I look back on this story, it's easy to see it as a simple tale of betrayal and vindication, good versus evil, truth versus lies. But the reality, like the physics of a complex structure, is far more nuanced. Serena was wrong, unequivocally. Her ambition curdled into a viciousness that cost me 5 years of my life. There is no excusing that. But my parents' failure was quieter, and in some ways, more profound. They weren't evil. They were blind. They were victims of their own value system, a system that taught them to applaud the performance and ignore the quiet, steady work happening backstage. Their sin wasn't malice. It was a profound lack of curiosity about their own child. They didn't see me because they never truly tried to look. And what about my part in it? I was the quiet one, the one who retreated into her work, hoping my genius would speak for itself. I enabled the dynamic for years, accepting the role of the engine in the basement because it was easier than fighting for a place in the sun. I learned a hard lesson. Talent without a voice can be easily silenced. The truth doesn't just win, it has to be fought for, articulated, and defended. The real tragedy is that it took the near collapse of a $500 million building for my family to finally learn how to listen. The message, if there is one, is this: the foundations of our lives, our families, our careers, our integrity, are only as strong as the truth they are built on. Cracks are inevitable, but it is how we respond to them that defines us. Do we hide them with plaster and paint, hoping no one notices? Or do we expose them, excavate the rot, and rebuild with stronger, more honest materials? Rebuilding is painful, slow, and unglamorous, but it's the only way to create something that will truly stand the test of time. I have 2 questions for you all. First, if you were in my parents' position, faced with a lie that confirmed your biases, do you honestly believe you would have sought out the truth? And second, what is the sky bridge in your life? That one thing you created that someone else tried to take credit for? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for listening.